When Europe began to slide toward catastrophe in the late 1930s, Winston Churchill stood almost alone in warning that a darkness was gathering beyond Britain's shores. Yet what set him apart was not merely his foresight but his voice, a voice that carried the weight of centuries, sharpened by adversity, and forged in the fires of personal struggle. Decades before the world would cling to his speeches like lifelines, Churchill had learned to wield words not as ornaments but as instruments of survival. From his youth, scarred by loneliness and a distant father who valued power over affection, he sought refuge in language, discovering that sentences could offer what people seldom did: structure, clarity, and order. As Europe lurched toward war, Churchill's voice, once dismissed as outdated thunder, would become the one anchor to which a nation in peril held fast. The British political establishment regarded him with caution, even suspicion. His warnings about Hitler seemed unfashionably alarmist, his rhetoric out of step with the wishful optimism that dominated Parliament. Neville Chamberlain and his allies believed diplomacy could tame fascism, that treaties could restrain evil. Churchill, however, understood that Hitler's power was inseparable from his language. Incendiary speeches that hypnotized millions and transformed grievances into ideology. To Churchill, meeting such a force required more than weapons and alliances. It required a counterlanguage capable of breaking the spell cast over Europe. His insistence on rearmament was therefore not just strategic but rhetorical, for he knew that once war erupted, it would be fought not only in fields and skies but in the hearts of ordinary citizens who needed to believe that freedom was still worth defending. Churchill's own relationship with words had been shaped by years of discipline. He treated speeches like military operations, drafting, redrafting, and rehearsing until the cadence struck the exact emotional resonance he intended. He wrote standing up, pacing, muttering phrases under his breath until they carried both thunder and clarity. This meticulous crafting was no affectation, it was survival. Long before the world would depend on him, he depended on language to navigate political exile, national criticism, and the long corridors of irrelevance. The so-called wilderness years, when almost no one listened to him, sharpened his sense of rhetoric. He practiced alerting a slumbering nation, building arguments like fortresses, preparing for the day when the world might once more need a voice capable of piercing complacency. By the spring of 1940, as Nazi armies tore through Europe with terrifying speed, Churchill's moment arrived, not through strategy but through necessity. Chamberlain's government collapsed under the weight of failed diplomacy, and Churchill, long considered a political liability, became prime minister. Britain was leaderless, frightened, and on the brink of collapse. At such a moment, no policy was enough. People needed to believe before they could fight. Churchill understood instinctively that the first battle to be won was psychological, that he had to lift a nation from despair to defiance with nothing more than breath and syllables. In his first speech to the House of Commons as Prime Minister, he offered not comfort but clarity, a blunt admission that suffering lay ahead. Yet even in that admission he embedded a promise, that Britain would endure and, through endurance, triumph. Behind the scenes, his broadcasts were rehearsed with the precision of battlefield drills. He insisted on speaking directly to the public via radio, a new, intimate medium that erased the distance between leader and citizen. Microphones captured not only his words but also the weight of them, the pauses, the gravelly undertones, the unmistakable rhythm that made even simple phrases resonate like scripture. He understood something few leaders of his age grasped. In a war of machines, morale could still shape destiny. Each syllable he uttered was a small act of resistance, a verbal bulwark against the tide of fear sweeping across Europe. Across the Channel, Hitler wielded words with equal mastery, but in service of domination rather than freedom. Nazi propaganda, pumped endlessly through rallies, newsreels, and radios, aimed to bend the will of millions and isolate Britain as a doomed island standing against history. Churchill recognized the danger in this narrative, not because it was militarily accurate, but because it threatened to reshape perceptions of inevitability. If people believed Britain's fall was preordained, then surrender would become rational. Thus Churchill's task was not merely to contradict Nazi rhetoric but to obliterate it, replacing narratives of inevitability with narratives of resilience. His language became Britain's spiritual armor, deflecting defeatism with defiance. In those early months of war, the country's fate rested precariously on faith. Faith in the RAF pilots preparing to face the Luftwaffe, faith in the Royal Navy guarding the seas, but above all, faith in the idea that Britain was not alone, not broken, not doomed. Churchill forged that faith through words that painted images of struggle not as misery but as martyrdom, not as punishment but as purpose. He wove history and mythology into his speeches, invoking centuries of British endurance, the Spanish Armada, Napoleon, ancient liberties, not to romanticize but to contextualize. He reminded people that their suffering was part of a greater arc of human defiance against tyranny, and in doing so, he transformed fear into fortitude. Thus, long before the bombs began to fall on London, Churchill had prepared his people for the coming storm through the force of language alone. His words had become the scaffolding upon which national courage was built. He understood that weapons could break, armies could falter, and governments could fall. But words, once spoken at the right moment, could ignite something indestructible. The forging of that rhetorical flame was his first great victory, and though the war had scarcely begun, Churchill had already demonstrated that a voice, wielded with conviction, could become a weapon mightier than steel. When Churchill delivered his blood, toil, tears and sweat speech, Britain was still reeling from the collapse of France and the brutal efficiency of the Nazi war machine. Many feared the same fate awaited them. Inside Downing Street, officials whispered grim predictions about invasion, the fall of London, and the possibility that Britain might negotiate with Hitler to save itself. Churchill knew these fears well, he shared them, but he also understood something deeper. Fear left unchallenged could metastasize into surrender. To counter this, he framed struggle as destiny, suffering as sacrifice, and endurance as victory in advance. In doing so, he shifted the psychological climate of the nation from dread to determination. His voice became the unseen hand steadying millions at a moment when collapse seemed imminent. He spoke not as a politician seeking approval but as a prophet of national identity, reminding people that they carried within them the legacy of ancient liberties Hitler sought to extinguish. This rhetorical framing was no accident. Churchill saw Britain's constitutional and cultural heritage as a moral fortress, and he placed it at the center of his wartime narrative. By doing so, he converted a military crisis into a civilizational struggle. Ordinary citizens no longer felt they were merely defending an island. They were safeguarding a lineage of freedom stretching back centuries. This psychological transformation, from fear to duty, was one of his greatest achievements, accomplished entirely with words. Radio allowed him to communicate with an intimacy no British leader before him had known. Unlike grand speeches in Parliament, radio brought him directly into living rooms, air raid shelters, hospital wards, and makeshift beds in underground stations. His voice traveled through blackout curtains, across bombed streets, and into the consciousness of a people desperately seeking stability. Listeners described the experience as receiving a personal visit, as though the Prime Minister himself had stepped inside their home to reassure them. In truth, he had engineered this effect deliberately. He wrote his speeches for sound, not sight, testing sentences aloud, gauging their emotional impact by ear. His mastery of the microphone turned the radio into a psychological shield as vital as any anti-aircraft gun. Unlike Hitler's orations, sweeping, furious, designed to dominate, Churchill's broadcasts relied on measured tempo, deliberate pauses, and a gravelly warmth that conveyed both gravity and reassurance. His delivery made danger seem manageable and sacrifice meaningful. When he spoke of bracing ourselves to our duties, he did so not as a commander issuing orders but as a fellow citizen sharing burdens. This nuance mattered. People obeyed him not out of coercion but because they believed he understood them. His words softened hardship by framing it as shared. The nation's suffering became collective and thus bearable. Churchill also mastered juxtaposition, the pairing of stark realism with soaring aspiration. When he warned of many long months of struggle and suffering, he followed it with, "But we shall never surrender." This pattern became his signature. He never disguised danger, he confronted it head-on. Yet he always balanced honesty with hope, grounding morale in truth rather than illusion. This rhetorical symmetry prevented despair while avoiding false optimism, making his appeals both persuasive and credible. Hitler used language to manufacture myth. Churchill used it to navigate reality. Behind the confident broadcasts lay immense pressure. Every sentence carried consequences. He was aware that poorly chosen words could induce panic, damage diplomacy, or expose weakness. But he also understood that powerful words could serve as strategic weapons, demoralizing the enemy, emboldening the Allies, and influencing neutral nations like the United States. Thus, his speeches were never mere morale boosters. They were components of a grand psychological strategy. They shaped how the world perceived Britain. They signaled resistance to the Axis, defiance to Hitler, and resolve to Roosevelt. They turned a vulnerable island into a symbol of uncompromising courage. Churchill's advisors sometimes urged caution, fearing he would provoke Germany or overpromise victory. But he rejected timidity. He believed that rhetoric in wartime must be bold enough to match the threat, yet disciplined enough to sustain morale even when losses mounted. This balance required extraordinary instinct, the ability to read national mood with near-clairvoyant precision. Across bombed neighborhoods and grieving families, he sensed not fragility but latent strength waiting to be awakened. His speeches served as the ignition. Thus, the night Britain first heard his voice as wartime leader was more than a political moment, it was a cultural turning point. His words offered a new emotional framework through which the public could interpret crisis. They replaced fear with resilience, uncertainty with purpose. In that early phase of war, when Britain lacked allies, resources, and strategic advantages, Churchill's greatest weapon was not artillery or aircraft, but language. With it, he transformed a frightened people into a nation ready to endure the unimaginable. The collapse of France was the greatest strategic disaster Western Europe had suffered in generations. For Britain, the fall was not merely a military catastrophe but a psychological earthquake. The belief that Hitler could be contained vanished overnight. Millions of refugees fled southward, German armored divisions raced unopposed across ancient battlefields, and British expeditionary forces were pushed toward the sea. Amid this chaos, Churchill understood that the moral dimension of the war now outweighed its tactical realities. Britain suddenly stood alone, without allies, without hope of continental rescue. In such a moment, the instinct of many governments would have been to negotiate, to grasp at any diplomatic escape. Churchill's words prevented that course from being discussed seriously. During cabinet meetings, he wielded rhetoric not only to inspire the public but to fortify wavering ministers. Some, haunted by memories of World War I's carnage, argued that further resistance would only prolong suffering unnecessarily. Churchill countered with language that redefined the stakes. He framed surrender as a betrayal of civilization itself, an abdication of moral responsibility. His words did not simply dismiss negotiation, they made it unthinkable. By invoking the future judgment of history, he cast resistance as the only honorable course. Even the faint-hearted found no language within which they could argue otherwise. In this sense, Churchill's rhetoric shaped policy at the highest level. The Dunkirk evacuation became the ultimate test of his verbal leadership. As British soldiers awaited annihilation or capture on the beaches, Churchill understood that the narrative surrounding their retreat would determine whether the nation viewed it as calamity or courage. His choice was brilliant. Instead of defining Dunkirk by defeat, he defined it by deliverance. The event became not a symbol of failure but a testament to collective bravery, the miracle of small craft, the unity of civilians and soldiers, the refusal of fate to extinguish hope. His framing of Dunkirk preserved national morale at the most fragile moment of the war. When he addressed the House of Commons after Dunkirk, Churchill unleashed one of the most iconic sequences of rhetoric in human history. The "we shall fight on the beaches" refrain echoed like a litany of defiance. Each "we shall fight" strengthened the rhythm of inevitability, portraying resistance as both duty and destiny. The speech served two purposes. It acknowledged the grim reality of the situation while engraving in public consciousness the idea that surrender was not an option. Hitler had believed Britain would collapse after France's fall. Churchill's words made collapse impossible. This rhetorical stance reverberated internationally. In Washington, Roosevelt listened closely, observing that Churchill's speeches were worth 1,000 guns. Neutral nations reconsidered their assumptions about Britain's fate. Resistance, once seen as irrational, now appeared heroic. Churchill had turned narrative into strategy, shaping foreign policy with syntax and cadence. His speeches became diplomatic tools, courting American sympathy and delaying Axis aggression against British colonies. The power of his language radiated far beyond Britain's borders. At home, the effect was even more profound. Families whose sons were stranded in France clung to Churchill's assurances that Britain's spirit would outlast temporary setbacks. Air raid wardens patrolling darkened streets repeated his lines under their breath. Teachers recited excerpts to children huddled in classrooms. His words were not mere broadcasts, they became part of everyday life, embedded in the national psyche. In a time of terrifying uncertainty, they provided continuity, stability, and meaning. Churchill's mastery lay partly in his ability to draw from history while addressing the present. He summoned imagery from the Elizabethan Navy, the Peninsular War, and even medieval chronicles to place Britain's struggle within a lineage of heroic resistance. This approach made modern events feel familiar, as though the nation had been preparing for this trial for centuries. By drawing on shared memory, he turned fear into recognition. Britain had faced existential threats before, and survived. By the time France fell completely, Churchill had already reframed the disaster into a narrative of British resilience. His words ensured that the nation would interpret catastrophe not as cause for surrender but as catalyst for greater determination. This redefinition of meaning was essential. Without it, Britain might not have endured the coming onslaught. Churchill's speeches had become the bedrock upon which the island's resistance was built, ensuring that even in strategic defeat, the country felt morally victorious. When the Luftwaffe unleashed its fury upon Britain in the autumn of 1940, the terror was relentless. Night after night, German bombers roared over London, Coventry, Liverpool, and countless smaller towns, transforming homes into rubble and families into refugees. In this crucible of fire, morale could easily have fractured. Churchill understood that bombs alone did not win wars, they broke societies. The battle for Britain's survival was as much psychological as it was aerial. Each morning, as smoke rose over shattered buildings, the public waited for Churchill's voice to interpret the previous night's devastation. In these moments, his rhetoric became a stabilizing force, transforming chaos into narrative and despair into endurance. His descriptions of the British people during the Blitz were crafted to elevate them from victims to heroes. He called firefighters "knights of the flame" and civilians "soldiers without uniforms." These metaphors did more than praise. They dignified suffering by placing civilians on the front line of national defense. Churchill understood that people could endure extraordinary hardship if they believed it had purpose. Thus, he framed nightly bombings not as punishment but as tests of character, trials through which the British identity was reforged. This rhetorical elevation of ordinary citizens strengthened the social cohesion Hitler hoped to destroy. Churchill's visits to bombed neighborhoods amplified this effect. He walked among ruins, comforting survivors, standing before fires still smoldering. But the power of these visits was magnified by the words he later used to describe them. He portrayed the afflicted not as fragile but as resolute, people who, despite losing homes and loved ones, refused to yield. His speeches effectively turned every ruined street into a monument of national courage. These rhetorical portraits became essential morale lifters, convincing people that resilience itself was an act of resistance. The phrase, "the Blitz spirit," did not exist before Churchill's speeches popularized it. He articulated a form of collective endurance that allowed people to interpret their suffering as meaningful. In a war where the enemy aimed to break willpower, Churchill strengthened it by giving the destruction emotional context. His language created a shared mythology, a sense that the British people were engaged in a heroic chapter of their national story. This mythologizing was not deception, it was psychological reinforcement, enabling millions to withstand horror without breaking. He also mastered the art of the emotional pivot, acknowledging pain while simultaneously invoking pride. After describing a destroyed city, he would praise its people with words that elevated devastation into defiance. This rhetorical structure allowed listeners to grieve without losing hope. He told them that endurance was victory in advance, and every night survived was another blow against tyranny. His ability to blend empathy with strength made him both relatable and commanding, deepening public trust. Even when the Blitz reached its deadliest peaks, Churchill refused to speak the language of fear. He taught the nation how to interpret danger, not through dread but through determination. When he declared, "We can take it," he was not merely expressing confidence, he was giving the public permission to see themselves as unbreakable. This simple phrase became part of national identity, echoing across shelters, factories, and military bases. It encapsulated his greatest rhetorical achievement, transforming collective vulnerability into collective invincibility. His wartime broadcasts also counteracted Nazi propaganda, which portrayed Britain as cornered and collapsing. Churchill dispelled these narratives with eloquence rooted in truth. He acknowledged losses but juxtaposed them with expressions of resolve. This honesty made his words more credible than Hitler's bombast. While German propaganda relied on exaggeration, Churchill relied on authenticity. In doing so, he reshaped global perception, convincing the world that Britain's endurance would outlast German aggression. By the end of the Blitz, Britain remained battered but unbowed. While anti-aircraft guns and fighter pilots had protected the nation physically, Churchill's language had protected it emotionally. His words bound people together in shared resilience, giving meaning to suffering and purpose to endurance. In the darkest nights of the war, when cities burned and futures seemed uncertain, his voice became the flame that refused to be extinguished. He understood instinctively that these young men, most barely out of school, required more than aircraft and training. They needed recognition, purpose, and the knowledge that their sacrifice bore the gratitude of an entire nation. This insight shaped his wartime rhetoric, culminating in one of the most iconic tributes in history, Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But this was not mere praise, it was strategic elevation. By placing the pilots within a grand moral frame, Churchill ensured that every Briton felt personally connected to their struggle, fostering a unity of purpose that transcended class, region, and political affiliation. Churchill's tribute came at a moment when exhaustion threatened even the bravest airmen. As squadrons dwindled and mechanics worked through endless nights, he recognized that morale on the ground was as vital as courage in the air. His speeches transformed the public into active participants in the pilots' fight. Factory workers building aircraft parts began leaving notes of encouragement hidden inside fuselages. Farmers stopped their work to watch dogfights overhead, whispering prayers for unknown pilots. Children collected scrap metal for the few, believing Churchill's words made every contribution significant. In this way, his rhetoric created a nationwide psychological ecosystem that sustained the RAF when resources alone could not. What made his "the few" speech so powerful was the way he juxtaposed fragility and grandeur. He described the pilots not as invincible warriors but as young, ordinary men who carried an extraordinary burden. This humanization deepened public empathy. When names of fallen pilots appeared in newspapers, families felt a personal loss, as if a relative had perished. Churchill's language ensured that every pilot's death resonated across the nation, strengthening collective resolve. He showed Britain that it was not statistics being lost, it was promise, youth, and the defenders of civilization itself. At the same time, Churchill's rhetoric served a strategic purpose on the international stage. He knew that the world was watching the Battle of Britain, and that the United States, though officially neutral, would interpret this conflict as a measure of Britain's viability. If the RAF collapsed, American support would fade. If the RAF endured, sympathy would grow. Churchill's speeches were thus calibrated to impress upon global audiences that Britain was fighting not simply for survival but for the preservation of democratic values. His praise for the pilots doubled as a message to Washington, that Britain possessed the willpower to justify American aid. Privately, Churchill was deeply anxious. Intelligence briefings told him how perilously thin Britain's fighter reserves were, how stretched radar operators had become, and how close the RAF occasionally came to collapse. Yet he never allowed even a trace of this doubt to seep into his public rhetoric. To do so would have been catastrophic. Instead, he used language as a shield, protecting the public from despair and the enemy from perceiving weakness. In moments of profound danger, he maintained a facade of unshakable confidence, a facade constructed entirely from words, but strong enough to support a nation. His speeches during this period also cultivated a sense of spiritual significance. Churchill portrayed the air battles not as mere clashes of machines but as epic confrontations between freedom and tyranny. His language shifted the conflict from the physical to the metaphysical. When Britons looked up at contrails streaking the sky, they did not see random dogfights. They saw the visible manifestation of their nation's soul defending itself. This transformation of perception was one of Churchill's greatest rhetorical achievements. It infused the war with meaning so profound that even the youngest children understood the moral stakes. Even within the RAF, Churchill's words altered internal morale. Pilots described reading his speeches during rare breaks between sorties. Mechanics pinned newspaper clippings of his tributes inside hangars. Many airmen later admitted that his praise motivated them as much as duty. They felt seen, valued, and immortalized while still alive. Rhetoric became a morale multiplier, increasing the fighting efficiency of the RAF by amplifying the sense of honor attached to their mission. Churchill's speeches thus functioned as invisible reinforcements, not material but emotional and no less essential. By the time the Luftwaffe shifted its priorities away from airfields and toward the bombing of London, the outcome of the Battle of Britain was no longer determined solely by aircraft production or tactical decisions. It had been shaped by a narrative Churchill crafted with unmatched precision. His words had elevated a small group of pilots into national icons and had welded the public into a collective force of will. When historians later declared the RAF victorious, they also acknowledged the rhetorical campaign that sustained them. In the end, Churchill's language proved as decisive as the Spitfire and the Hurricane. His voice became the wind beneath the wings of the few, ensuring that their triumph echoed not only across the skies but across history itself. The winter of 1940-41 brought new horrors as the Blitz intensified, targeting not only London but dozens of provincial cities whose defenses were limited and whose populations were unprepared for the scale of destruction unleashed upon them. Entire streets vanished in minutes, factories burned for days, and cathedrals collapsed into smoking ruins. For the government, the greatest fear was not material loss but a collapse in morale, the one vulnerability Hitler counted on to break Britain's resistance. Churchill approached this phase of the war with a clear understanding. His words must function as psychological armor, protecting civilians from the corrosive effects of terror. He recognized that people needed more than statistics and military updates. They needed emotional validation, spiritual reinforcement, and a framework through which they could interpret suffering without succumbing to despair. His speeches during this phase did not shy away from the horrors unfolding across the nation. He described destruction candidly, often with vivid imagery that showed he understood the pain people endured. Yet he balanced honesty with resilience, transforming devastation into symbols of unity. When Coventry was reduced to rubble, Churchill reframed the tragedy as a testament to British fortitude. He spoke of shattered churches whose bells would one day ring again, of families who had lost everything but their courage. This rhetorical strategy allowed people to grieve without feeling defeated. By naming their suffering, he acknowledged their pain. By asserting its meaning, he gave them strength. Churchill's ability to shift between mourning and defiance was unparalleled. He would lament the destruction of homes before immediately praising the unbroken spirit of their occupants. This duality enabled citizens to see themselves not as victims but as participants in a collective act of resistance. They began interpreting their endurance as a contribution to victory. The emotional alchemy he performed, transforming personal loss into national pride, was crucial to sustaining morale. His speeches effectively created a new civic identity, one in which every citizen, regardless of age or class, was a frontline defender. His radio addresses became rituals of reassurance. Families gathered around wireless sets during blackout hours, waiting for his familiar voice to pierce the silence. The cadence of his speech, deliberate, solemn, yet firm, brought comfort to those living in darkness. His tone carried an authority beyond political office. It possessed the gravity of someone who understood suffering intimately. Churchill had endured personal sorrows, military failures, and political exile. These experiences infused his broadcasts with authenticity, making his empathy feel earned rather than strategic. People trusted him because he spoke with the conviction of someone who had known despair and overcome it. Churchill's rhetoric also played a key strategic role in countering Nazi psychological warfare. The Germans believed that terror from the skies would break Britain's resolve, forcing it to negotiate. Churchill's speeches directly attacked this assumption. He portrayed every bombing raid as evidence of the enemy's desperation, claiming that Hitler targeted civilians only because he had failed to defeat the RAF. This reframing transformed fear into contempt, anger, and resolve. Instead of seeing themselves as prey, Britons began to view themselves as obstacles to Hitler's ambitions, denying him the swift victory he craved. Churchill had successfully turned the psychological tables. Another hallmark of his rhetoric during the Blitz was the personalization of sacrifice. Churchill often highlighted individual stories: firefighters who fought until collapse, mothers shielding children in shelters, rescue workers digging through rubble. By elevating personal bravery, he created a tapestry of heroism that made ordinary people feel extraordinary. This sense of shared valor strengthened social cohesion and discouraged defeatism. People who believed their suffering had dignity were far more willing to endure it. Churchill had created not just a narrative, but a national ethos. The Prime Minister also recognized the need to maintain a delicate balance between solemnity and hope. Too much grief would paralyze, too much optimism would insult reality. He walked this tightrope with unparalleled skill. His speeches often ended with forward-looking affirmations, that Britain would one day rebuild, that the enemy would be defeated, that peace would return. These promises were not empty. They were commitments anchored in his own sense of destiny and deep understanding of history. Churchill believed in the arc of struggle and redemption, and he conveyed this belief with such certainty that the public adopted it as their own. By the time the Blitz began to wane, Churchill's words had done something extraordinary. They had preserved not just morale but meaning. Britons emerged from the firestorms not broken but bonded, sustained by the belief that their endurance had shaped the destiny of the free world. Through rhetoric alone, Churchill had transformed a campaign of terror into a crucible of unity. His voice had shielded the nation when walls crumbled and horizons burned. And though the worst trials of the war were yet to come, his mastery of language had already proven indispensable to Britain's survival. As Britain fought for survival in the early years of the war, Churchill recognized that victory required more than defiance. It required allies, particularly across the Atlantic. Yet the United States remained officially neutral, bound by isolationist sentiment, economic caution, and the lingering trauma of World War I. Churchill understood that no amount of military argument would shift American opinion unless it was underpinned by emotional and moral persuasion. Thus began one of the most sophisticated rhetorical campaigns in diplomatic history, a sustained, deliberate effort to shape American perception not through policy papers but through narrative, symbolism, and a sense of shared destiny. Churchill wielded language as a diplomatic bridge, building emotional proximity between two nations separated by an ocean and contrasting historical experiences. Central to his approach was the evocation of Anglo-American kinship. Churchill emphasized the shared cultural lineage between Britain and the United States, a lineage rooted in language, law, and liberty. He drew on the imagery of Magna Carta, the English Civil War, and the philosophical foundations of democracy, weaving these threads into a story of related civilizations defending the same inheritance. By portraying Britain not as an empire clinging to privilege but as the custodian of freedoms Americans cherished, he reframed the war as a family affair, a call to defend shared values rather than foreign shores. This rhetorical strategy humanized Britain in American eyes and cast Hitler as a threat not just to Europe but to the democratic experiment itself. Churchill's speeches were carefully timed to align with American political cycles, public debates, and shifts in congressional opinion. He praised American industry, celebrated American culture, and highlighted the courage of American volunteers who joined the RAF before official U.S. entry. He used humor, affection, and humility, qualities rarely visible in his wartime broadcasts, to charm American audiences. When he spoke to them, he softened his tone, exchanging the thunder of defiance for a warm, almost intimate cadence. He offered gratitude without pleading, partnership without presumption. These subtle shifts in rhetorical temperature helped him navigate the complexities of American politics, especially the skepticism of isolationists who viewed European wars as distant tragedies rather than shared responsibilities. His private communications with President Roosevelt were masterpieces of personal diplomacy. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt with a blend of eloquence, urgency, and strategic flattery, addressing him as a friend and equal. He used metaphors drawn from naval history, shared anecdotes from past crises, and appeals to Roosevelt's own sense of global duty. These letters gradually built a bond of trust so strong that it influenced American foreign policy more than any formal agreement. Churchill's ability to speak to Roosevelt not simply as a statesman but as a storyteller created an emotional connection that transcended traditional diplomacy. In effect, he recruited Roosevelt to Britain's cause through narrative, by crafting a shared story in which both men stood as protagonists defending civilization. When Churchill delivered his famous address to the British Parliament after the passage of the Lend-Lease Act, he celebrated not merely a political triumph but the success of rhetorical persuasion. Lend-Lease was a lifeline, allowing Britain to receive vital supplies without immediate payment. Churchill understood that behind the legislation lay a shift in American consciousness, a shift his words had helped create. He framed the act as the moment when the lamps of friendship had been lit across the Atlantic, signaling a new epoch in international cooperation. His language elevated the legislation into a symbol of shared moral purpose, ensuring that both Britons and Americans perceived the alliance not as transactional but as historical. Churchill's first wartime visit to the United States in 1941 became a triumph of oratory and symbolism. He addressed Congress with a mixture of gravitas and charm, recounting Britain's endurance while emphasizing the unity of democratic nations. His speech, punctuated by applause, laughter, and moments of solemn silence, demonstrated his ability to tailor rhetoric to the emotional register of his audience. He spoke not as a supplicant but as a partner, declaring that Britain would fight with or without American assistance, yet leaving no doubt that unity between the nations represented the surest path to victory. This blend of dignity and camaraderie endeared him to American leaders and citizens alike. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the strategic landscape, but Churchill's words ensured that U.S. entry into the war was framed not as an act of retaliation but as part of a larger struggle for human dignity. He immediately conveyed solidarity, declaring that British and American destinies were now linked together in solemn union. His rhetoric emphasized shared sacrifice, shared danger, and shared triumph. He did not gloat that the U.S. had finally joined the war. Instead, he interpreted the moment as the fulfillment of a long-foretold partnership, a joining of forces ordained by history. By doing so, he preserved American pride while cementing British gratitude. By the time Churchill returned to Britain, the Atlantic Alliance was no longer a fragile political arrangement. It had become a moral coalition rooted in shared mythology and emotional resonance. Churchill's words had achieved what diplomacy alone could not, They had transformed American participation in the war into a matter of identity, principle, and destiny. Through narrative, metaphor, and emotional intelligence, he had rewritten the script of global politics, forging an alliance that would not only shape the outcome of the war but define the balance of power for generations. In this phase of the conflict, Churchill's greatest weapon was not military equipment or strategic planning. It was his voice, reaching across an ocean to summon a nation into history. As the war intensified across multiple fronts, Churchill confronted not only military threats but a vast ideological battlefield where truth itself became a weapon. Nazi Germany poured enormous resources into propaganda, attempting to sow doubt within British society, undermine Allied unity, and present Hitler as a victorious, unstoppable force. Goebbels orchestrated a media machine of deception, broadcasting exaggerated troop movements, fabricated British casualties, and incessant predictions of imminent collapse. Churchill understood that the battle against this psychological onslaught was every bit as important as defending the skies over London or the seas around the British Isles. Thus, he engaged in a relentless campaign to control the narrative, using words as countermeasures against lies, distortions, and fear. His speeches became the compass by which millions navigated an ocean of enemy misinformation. Although Britain had its own propaganda apparatus, the Ministry of Information, the BBC, and a vast network of civil service communicators, Churchill remained at its emotional center. His speeches were the touchstones that grounded all other messaging. He recognized that propaganda without authenticity was hollow, and so he insisted upon a delicate balance. Truth must never be sacrificed, yet hope must always be present. Unlike Nazi broadcasts, which relied on bluster, fabrications, and hysteria, Churchill's rhetoric gained strength from candor. When bombs fell, he said so. When setbacks occurred, he acknowledged them. This honesty made his optimism credible, his predictions respectable, and his appeals irresistible. As a result, Nazi propaganda increasingly failed to penetrate British morale, bouncing off a population that trusted its own leader more deeply with each passing crisis. Churchill also expanded the meaning of propaganda beyond mere information. For him, it was a form of storytelling, the shaping of a people's emotional reality during war. He knew that facts alone could not sustain morale. They had to be placed within narratives of resilience, destiny, and purpose. Rather than simply refuting German lies, he reframed them. When Goebbels claimed Britain was isolated, Churchill portrayed isolation as a badge of honor, a lonely sentinel of liberty resisting the darkness engulfing Europe. When German broadcasts predicted starvation, he turned rationing into an emblem of shared sacrifice. In this way, Churchill transformed enemy narratives into fuel for British unity, alchemizing attempts at psychological sabotage into catalysts of resolve. One of Churchill's most brilliant strategies was his use of symbolic language. He often reduced complex geopolitical realities to vivid metaphors that ordinary citizens could grasp. Hitler became a monster of wickedness, the Luftwaffe, the Huns in the air, and Nazi ideology, a plague upon the earth. These metaphors crystallized the moral stakes of the conflict, making it easier for listeners to identify with the struggle. At the same time, he used equally powerful images to describe Britain's resilience: the island fortress, the lion-hearted people, the fire that would not be quenched. These symbols resonated deeply, offering citizens a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. Through metaphor, Churchill democratized heroism, granting every Briton a place within the epic narrative of resistance. Churchill's war against propaganda extended far beyond national borders. He understood that global perception influenced everything from economic support to military strategy. His speeches were broadcast across the empire, translated into dozens of languages, and quoted in foreign newspapers from Cairo to Buenos Aires. Each word carried diplomatic weight. When he spoke of the dark, foul tide of Nazi tyranny, he galvanized occupied nations. When he declared Britain would fight in all circumstances, he reassured allies that the last stronghold of democracy would not buckle. And when he praised colonial troops, he strengthened the bonds of imperial cooperation. Churchill's rhetoric was thus not merely patriotic, it was internationalist, building a coalition of emotions long before a coalition of armies fully materialized. While his public speeches rallied free peoples, Churchill also waged a quieter war of words against Axis influence in neutral countries. Through carefully crafted appeals and private messages, he sought to counteract German propaganda in Spain, Sweden, Turkey, and South America. He emphasized British endurance, highlighted Axis atrocities, and framed neutrality itself as a moral crossroads. These communications were strategic masterpieces, calibrated to each nation's political sensitivities. His goal was not to bully but to persuade, using language to reshape perceptions of risk and opportunity. In many cases, this rhetorical finesse prevented neutral nations from leaning toward the Axis or offering them resources. Thus, Churchill's words indirectly influenced supply chains, intelligence networks, and diplomatic stances, all critical to the broader war effort. Inside Britain, Churchill's speeches also served to manage fear, a psychological force as dangerous as bombs. Rumors, conspiracies, and panic had the potential to destabilize society, especially during long nights in air raid shelters when whispers traveled quickly. Churchill addressed these fears directly. He reassured the elderly that shelters were safe, assured parents that evacuation policies would protect their children, and reminded workers that their labor was vital to victory. His ability to anticipate public anxieties before they exploded into crises was a hallmark of his rhetorical genius. He used language as a stabilizing force, calming a population vulnerable to the stresses of prolonged warfare. By mid-war, Churchill had achieved something unprecedented in modern conflict. He had rendered Nazi propaganda largely ineffective within Britain. Despite the enormous resources of Goebbels' propaganda ministry, British morale remained resilient, anchored by a leader whose voice had become synonymous with truth, courage, and endurance. Churchill's mastery of storytelling, metaphor, and emotional intelligence had created a national immune system against misinformation. In an era when whole armies crumbled under psychological warfare, Britain stood firm, in large part because of the rhetorical shield Churchill constructed with extraordinary precision. Through language, he upheld not just the nation's morale, but the integrity of reality itself. The longer the war endured, the more Churchill recognized that victory depended not only on armies abroad but on unity at home, a unity threatened by exhaustion, grief, rationing, and the relentless pressure of daily survival. Millions lived under the constant strain of separation. Husbands at sea, sons in North Africa, daughters in munitions factories. Families struggled with shortages, queues, blackouts, and the unending fear that a knock on the door might bring tragic news. Churchill understood that morale was a fragile, living organism. It required nourishment, protection, and reaffirmation. Through his speeches, he became the emotional steward of the nation, binding disparate experiences into a shared narrative of endurance. His words served as a national glue, preventing social fractures that could have weakened Britain from within. With remarkable psychological instinct, he addressed each segment of society individually yet inclusively. Factory workers were praised as the army behind the armies, their labor described as no less vital than frontline bravery. Housewives managing ration books were honored as the quiet backbone of the war effort. Children evacuated to rural villages were called the young sentinels of the future. This linguistic elevation transformed ordinary tasks into acts of heroism. By embedding dignity into daily hardships, Churchill ensured that no citizen felt irrelevant, overlooked, or diminished. His vision of unity was not rhetorical abstraction. It was a daily reinforcement of purpose, designed to make every individual feel essential to the national struggle. Churchill's ability to navigate class divides through rhetoric was perhaps his most subtle achievement. Britain in the 1940s was still a rigidly stratified society, with deep distinctions between aristocrats, workers, civil servants, and colonial subjects. Yet Churchill's speeches transcended these boundaries. He spoke in a language that resonated with the intellectual and the laborer alike, blending Shakespearean cadence with simple, resonant phrasing. His voice, gravelly, seasoned, unmistakably human, belonged to no single class. When he addressed the nation, he did so as a unifying figure, a conduit through which the country could momentarily transcend its divisions. This rhetorical universality helped prevent class tension from escalating during a time when strain could easily have ignited conflict. Even political dissent could not fracture the unity Churchill forged. Though war did not erase ideological differences, his oratory reframed debate within a larger moral mission. Critics who opposed specific policies nevertheless supported the national cause because Churchill's words reminded them that they stood on common ground, the survival of their civilization. His speeches transformed politics into patriotism. The usual machinery of partisanship softened under the weight of shared danger. His coalition government, an unprecedented union of rival parties, was held together not merely by necessity but by the emotional gravity of Churchill's leadership. Through his words, he made unity feel natural, inevitable, even sacred. Churchill also excelled at acknowledging hardship without romanticizing it. When food shortages intensified, he did not pretend the situation was tolerable. Instead, he thanked the public for their restraint, emphasizing that their sacrifices protected soldiers abroad. When cities faced housing crises after bombings, he addressed the issue personally, describing destroyed streets with palpable sympathy. This acknowledgement of struggle prevented resentment from festering. People felt seen. Their suffering was recognized, not dismissed. In this way, Churchill used honesty as a tool for solidarity, proving that truth, delivered with empathy, could strengthen morale more than hollow reassurances ever could. His rhetorical embrace extended to the empire, though not without complexity. Churchill saw the colonies as integral parts of Britain's global strength and made repeated appeals for shared sacrifice. Indian soldiers were praised for their valor in North Africa. African troops were commended for their loyalty and endurance. These tributes were genuine, though they existed within the constraints of Churchill's imperial worldview. Nonetheless, they had real impact, reinforcing the sense that the war was a collective endeavor. Millions of colonial subjects felt that their contributions mattered, that they were participants in a struggle larger than themselves, an emotional connection forged primarily through Churchill's words. During the war's most difficult winters, when coal shortages bit deeply and blackout fatigue wore down spirits, Churchill delivered some of his most powerful homefront speeches. He reminded families that the hardships they endured protected the men on the front lines. He spoke of Britain as a single family of courage, bound by loyalty and love. These metaphors were not ornamental, they were psychological architecture. They transformed the concept of nationhood from abstraction into intimacy. Britain became not simply a political entity but a household under siege, and every member of that household had a role in its survival. By the time Allied forces turned the tide of the war, Britain remained a remarkably cohesive society, especially considering the relentless pressure it had endured. While danger had forged unity, Churchill's words had sustained it. He had given millions the emotional strength to endure separation, fear, and sacrifice. Through his ability to articulate purpose, acknowledge suffering, and inspire pride, he ensured that Britain's social fabric did not fray under the weight of hardship. His voice became the steady heartbeat of a nation undergoing unimaginable stress. And though victory remained distant, Britain's greatest internal battle, the battle to remain united, had already been won through the power of Churchill's lang. As the war expanded beyond Europe into North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, Churchill's rhetorical responsibilities evolved. His task was no longer merely to sustain British morale or secure American partnership. It was to articulate a coherent vision of Allied victory, a vision that could align three vastly different great powers: Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Each pursued its own strategic interests, was governed by a distinct political system, and had endured unique national traumas. Churchill recognized that without shared purpose, the coalition would fracture under pressure. Thus, he deployed language as a tool of military diplomacy, crafting speeches and communiques that elevated common objectives above divisive realities. His words served as connective tissue between leaders who did not fully trust one another, binding them within a rhetorical framework that emphasized unity, inevitability, and the moral imperative of defeating Nazism. Churchill's strategic rhetoric relied heavily on imagery of inevitability. When he declared that victory was not only possible but certain, he was not indulging in optimism. He was shaping the psychological landscape of Allied decision-making. Roosevelt, Stalin, and their respective military staffs listened closely to Churchill's pronouncements. His confidence influenced debates on resource allocation, offensive timing, and the prioritization of theaters. By presenting the war's trajectory as part of a grand historical arc, a struggle between barbarism and civilization, Churchill encouraged partners to see the conflict not through the lens of short-term hardship but through the promise of long-term triumph. This narrative cohesion helped prevent political squabbles from unraveling strategic cooperation during the war's darkest moments. His mastery of symbolic language played a crucial role during high-stakes conferences such as Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta. At Casablanca, where the Allies declared the policy of unconditional surrender, Churchill understood that the phrasing would shape global expectations. Though the concept originated with Roosevelt, Churchill embraced and expanded it rhetorically, framing it as the only moral response to Nazi crimes. He articulated the necessity of complete victory not as vengeance but as the means of securing lasting peace. His language crafted a psychological barrier against any temptation to negotiate with Hitler, reinforcing Allied resolve even when the cost of war soared. For the troops on the front lines, this clarity of purpose became a source of moral direction. Churchill also recognized that words could influence the pace and nature of military operations. When advocating for campaigns in the Mediterranean, He framed them as strategic strokes against the soft underbelly of Europe, a metaphor so compelling that it shaped Allied planning for years. Though the phrase oversimplified the complexity of Italian and Balkan campaigns, it provided an accessible visual that captured the imagination of generals and politicians alike. Such metaphors were not mere ornamentation. They were conceptual tools that shaped how decision-makers perceived the geography and psychology of warfare. Churchill's linguistic clarity often cut through bureaucratic inertia, pushing ambitious operations forward when timidity threatened to stall progress. Yet Churchill's rhetoric also had to navigate the tension between allies, especially with Stalin, whose authoritarian sensibilities and geopolitical ambitions often conflicted with British and American visions of post-war Europe. Churchill used language to build bridges where trust was thin. He praised Soviet resilience, acknowledged their monumental sacrifices on the Eastern Front, and spoke of Allied cooperation as a threefold cord that could not be broken. These rhetorical gestures served a strategic purpose. They reassured Stalin that Britain respected Soviet contributions, even as Churchill privately feared communist expansion. Through careful phrasing, he maintained diplomatic balance during precarious negotiations, enabling a coalition that might otherwise have shattered under ideological strain. Churchill's speeches during the war's turning points, El Alamein, Stalingrad, D-Day, were crafted with almost surgical precision. At El Alamein, he declared that the victory marked, not the end, not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. This phrase became emblematic of his ability to capture complex strategic realities in accessible, unforgettable terms. It reassured a war-weary public that progress was real, even if triumph remained distant. At D-Day, he framed the Normandy landings as the opening of the Great Crusade, elevating the invasion beyond military operation into moral pilgrimage. His words infused operations with meaning, transforming tactical maneuvers into chapters within a heroic epic. Even as the tide shifted decisively toward the Allies, Churchill maintained rhetorical discipline. He warned against complacency, reminding the public and fellow leaders that war's final stages often proved the most brutal. His speeches emphasized the need for relentless pressure against the Axis, using phrases like "crush the serpent's head" to convey the urgency of total dismantlement. He balanced triumph with caution, optimism with vigilance. This duality prevented premature relaxation, ensuring that Allied unity held firm through the final year of conflict. His rhetoric served as a stabilizing force, tempering exuberance while sustaining momentum. By war's end, Churchill had woven together a strategic tapestry of words that guided the Allies toward victory. His speeches were not mere reflections of military events, they helped shape them. They aligned disparate nations under a shared vision, provided moral justification for difficult choices, and transformed complex strategies into compelling narratives. Through language, he built the psychological and diplomatic foundation on which the Allies executed the largest coalition war in human history. Churchill had demonstrated that in total war, strategy was not only planned on maps and in councils, it was also forged in speeches, letters, metaphors, and declarations that unified the will of nations. His ability to articulate victory helped make victory possible. As the war reached its crescendo, Churchill faced an agonizing dual responsibility: to celebrate victories that lifted the nation's spirits while honoring the growing number of dead whose sacrifice made those victories possible. Every mile the Allies advanced across Europe or Asia was purchased with blood. Each headline of triumph bore a shadow of loss. Churchill knew that if he allowed triumphalism to overshadow grief, he would fracture the emotional covenant he had built with the British people. And so he spoke with a solemn reverence that blended pride with mourning. In his speeches, the fallen were not statistics but sacred guardians of freedom, woven into the very fabric of national memory. By giving eloquent voice to collective grief, he lifted mourning into the realm of meaning, ensuring that bereavement strengthened morale rather than eroding it. Churchill had an uncanny ability to articulate sorrow in a way that validated private pain while reinforcing public purpose. When entire regiments were lost at sea or decimated in battle, he addressed the nation with a tone that oscillated between tender sympathy and unyielding resolve. He often referred to the fallen as the great company of the valorous, evoking imagery of timeless armies stretching back through British history, Agincourt, Waterloo, the Somme, thereby placing modern sacrifice within an ancient lineage of courage. This rhetorical lineage comforted families by assuring them that their loved ones had not died in anonymity but had joined a continuum of heroes who shaped the destiny of the nation. He was equally sensitive when addressing civilians who had died in air raids. Churchill refused to allow their loss to be treated as collateral damage or minimized as accidental tragedy. Instead, he elevated civilian sacrifice to the same moral stature as military service. He described fallen mothers, clerks, dockworkers, and children as martyrs of the home front, whose endurance and courage had held the nation together under bombardment. This leveling of honor, placing civilians and soldiers within the same heroic narrative, was unprecedented in British rhetoric. By doing so, he strengthened social solidarity, ensuring that grief did not create divisions between those who fought and those who waited. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Churchill's wartime oratory was his refusal to allow death to be seen as futile. Even in moments of staggering loss, he framed sacrifice as part of a moral equation whose outcome justified every hardship. After the heavy casualties in North Africa, he spoke of the fallen as the price of breaking tyranny's grip. After the losses on the Eastern Front, he praised Russian soldiers with a generosity rare among wartime leaders, acknowledging their sacrifice as essential to the liberation of Europe. He constantly sought to ensure that the public understood the connection between suffering and purpose, that death was not only mourned but consecrated within the larger struggle for humanity. Churchill's attention to individual stories further humanized the war. He often read letters from bereaved parents, widows, or soldiers on the front lines. Though these letters rarely appeared directly in his speeches, they informed his tone, metaphors, and emotional pacing. He saw himself not only as a national leader but as a custodian of collective sorrow, responsible for transforming anguish into strength. He understood that grief, if left unaddressed, could curdle into bitterness, but if honored sincerely, it could become an anchor of unity. Through his eloquence, he helped millions feel that they were not grieving alone, that the nation grieved with them. Even as victory approached, Churchill refused to let the enthusiasm of the moment eclipse the memory of the fallen. His speeches during the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final push into Germany contained passages of sober remembrance. He reminded people of the comrades who will not return, and insisted that freedom must be built in their honor. This rhetorical restraint distinguished him from many wartime leaders. He understood that victory untempered by humility could appear callous. Instead, he cast triumph as a sacred responsibility, a trust bequeathed by the dead to the living. When he spoke on VE Day, Churchill delivered one of the most emotionally balanced speeches of the entire war. He expressed unrestrained joy at the downfall of Hitler, but he immediately followed it with a tribute to those who gave their all. His voice cracked as he acknowledged the long line of brave men and women whose constancy and courage brought us through. This vulnerability resonated deeply with the public. Millions who celebrated in the streets also wept when they heard his words. He had captured the emotional paradox of the moment perfectly. Britain stood victorious, yet forever marked by loss. By the war's end, Churchill's rhetorical honoring of the fallen had become part of Britain's national identity. His speeches helped crystallize the moral significance of sacrifice and shaped the way the nation remembered the war for generations. Monuments, ceremonies, and public traditions that emerged in the post-war years echoed themes he had articulated during the conflict: duty, courage, unity, and remembrance. Churchill ensured that grief did not dissipate into private sorrow but became a shared source of strength. His words gave the fallen a legacy that transcended death, embedding them into the permanent story of Britain's survival. Through this, he demonstrated perhaps the most humane dimension of his leadership: the capacity to turn loss into collective dignity. With the guns finally falling silent in 1945, Churchill faced a world irrevocably changed, a world that required not victory speeches but prophetic warnings. Though voted out of office within months of VE Day, he refused to retreat into silence. Instead, he wielded words once more as weapons not against the Nazis, but against the emerging shadow he believed threatened the fragile post-war order: Soviet expansion. Churchill saw with haunting clarity that though one tyranny had fallen, another was rising behind the Iron Curtain. His wartime rhetoric had summoned courage, unity, and perseverance. Now his post-war rhetoric sought to summon vigilance. He understood that in peace, complacency could be as dangerous as fear had been in war. Thus began his second great campaign, a rhetorical struggle to awaken the Western world to the peril of unchecked totalitarian ambition. His famous 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, the Iron Curtain Address, stands as one of the most consequential orations of the 20th century. Speaking before an American audience still basking in victory and yearning for normalcy, Churchill shattered illusions of lasting harmony between the wartime allies. With grave precision, he described how Soviet domination had descended across Eastern Europe, extinguishing the very freedoms Britain and America had fought to preserve. His warning was not bluster but diagnosis. Churchill recognized that ideological warfare had replaced military conflict, and he declared that the defense of liberty required moral clarity long before it required armies. His words were a diplomatic thunderclap, setting the intellectual foundation for what would become the Cold War. Just as he had once warned about Hitler when few listened, he now warned about Stalin, again speaking truth before the world was ready to hear it. Churchill's post-war rhetoric did not advocate confrontation for its own sake. Instead, he sought to shape peace through strength, urging Western nations to unite, uphold democratic values, and maintain military readiness as a deterrent to aggression. In countless speeches, he emphasized that freedom required more than celebration, it required guardianship. He called for the establishment of a permanent international partnership, foreshadowing NATO years before it existed. To him, peace was not the absence of conflict but the triumph of harmony over coercion. His ability to articulate complex geopolitical realities in relatable terms allowed citizens across Europe and America to understand the stakes of the new era. One of Churchill's most innovative rhetorical strategies was his emphasis on rebuilding Europe not merely as a collection of nations, but as a united civilizational project. In a 1946 speech in Zurich, he called for nothing less than a United States of Europe, an audacious vision that shocked contemporaries. Though he did not imagine Britain as a member of such a union, he believed that France and Germany must integrate to prevent future wars. His phrasing, hopeful, visionary, and rooted in historical consciousness, provided the conceptual blueprint for European cooperation. He understood that words could inspire political architecture, and indeed, many of the founders of modern Europe later cited Churchill's speeches as catalysts for their thinking. Churchill's rhetorical emphasis on freedom, however, was not naive. He recognized that the post-war world was filled with dangers, from nuclear weapons to decolonization conflicts to economic instability. His speeches served as emotional and intellectual stabilizers, guiding citizens through an uncertain transition. In parliamentary debates, he combined warnings with reassurance. He praised scientific progress while cautioning that nuclear power placed humanity on a precipice of destiny. He championed social reform while insisting that prosperity must never weaken national defense. Through this careful balance, he remained a voice of reason during a time when many Western nations felt overwhelmed by rapid geopolitical shifts. Even outside formal politics, Churchill's influence endured through the sheer force of his rhetoric. His memoirs, speeches, and letters became essential texts for a world struggling to understand the meaning of the war it had survived. His multi-volume history of World War II shaped global memory of the conflict, blending personal experience with sweeping narrative. Critics noted, sometimes with envy, sometimes with irritation, that Churchill had succeeded in writing the story of the war in a way that ensured his perspective became the framework through which future generations would interpret it. In this sense, language became his final battlefield. He fought to preserve the moral clarity of the war's legacy. Churchill's warnings about the Soviet Union were not universally accepted. Some accused him of warmongering. Others dismissed his Iron Curtain speech as residual wartime paranoia. Yet as Soviet influence spread deeper into Eastern Europe, as Berlin was blockaded, as communist movements ignited civil conflict across Asia, Churchill's words began to seem less alarmist and more prescient. The moral narrative he crafted, framing the Cold War as a struggle for the soul of humanity, became the guiding ethos of Western policy for decades. His rhetorical clarity, refined through years of confronting Nazi tyranny, proved invaluable once again. In the end, Churchill's post-war speeches were not merely political interventions. They were philosophical meditations on power, freedom, and the responsibilities of victory. He taught Western nations that peace was neither effortless nor eternal, that vigilance must continue even after triumph, and that words could serve as fortresses against the encroaching shadows of tyranny. Through his voice, he sought to architect a world that would honor the sacrifices of the fallen by safeguarding the liberties they died to protect. His rhetorical legacy did not end with the war, it merely evolved, shaping the contours of an entire era. In peace as in war, Churchill used words not simply to communicate, but to warn, guide, inspire, and defend. As the decades passed after the war, scholars, statesmen, and citizens alike continued to revisit Churchill's speeches, not merely as artifacts of a bygone era, but as enduring models of leadership in times of existential crisis. His oratory was studied in universities, quoted in parliaments, and imitated by political leaders attempting to capture even a fraction of his rhetorical force. Churchill had not only used words as weapons, he had redefined what leadership could mean in the modern age. He proved that the spoken word, when wielded with precision, integrity, and emotional intelligence, could shape the destiny of nations. His speeches became templates for communicating in crises, honest yet uplifting, sobering yet galvanizing, grounded in reality yet elevated by vision. Few leaders since have matched his ability to speak to both the head and the heart simultaneously. Part of Churchill's enduring influence rests in the remarkable breadth of his rhetorical arsenal. He mastered tones that seemed contradictory yet harmonious, the solemnity of mourning, the ferocity of defiance, the grandeur of historical reflection, the intimacy of personal reassurance. He could speak like a prophet, warning of future dangers, like a commander, issuing calls to action, like a poet, weaving imagery that lingered in memory, and like a friend, offering comfort to the weary. This versatility allowed him to adapt his message to shifting political landscapes, social anxieties, and military developments. Modern leaders often struggle to achieve such balance, either lapsing into technocratic detachment or losing themselves in grandiose emotionality. Churchill's speeches stood at the golden intersection of clarity and inspiration, where truth was neither diluted nor weaponized irresponsibly. One of the most remarkable features of Churchill's legacy is that he spoke to entire populations, yet individuals often felt addressed personally. Survivors of the Blitz, veterans of North Africa, widows of the Atlantic convoys, many later recalled that Churchill's broadcasts felt intimate, as though his voice were speaking directly into their kitchens, their shelters, their quiet moments of fear. This ability to shrink the vast machinery of war into a human-scale conversation endowed his speeches with enduring emotional weight. Leadership in the decades that followed, during the Cold War, civil rights movements, and national emergencies, frequently sought to replicate this intimate mass communication. Yet few could match Churchill's instinct for calibrating tone, pace, and imagery to meet people in their most vulnerable moments. Churchill's influence is also evident in how he shaped the moral vocabulary of democracy. Phrases like the freedom-loving nations, the survival of Christian civilization, and the lights going out across Europe did more than describe events. They framed global politics as a struggle between liberty and tyranny. This framing influenced generations of policymakers, who inherited a worldview articulated in Churchill's wartime broadcasts. Even leaders who disagreed with Churchill's politics found themselves using language steeped in his metaphors when defending democratic ideals. His words became part of the intellectual DNA of the Western world, shaping how societies understood threats to freedom and the responsibilities of citizenship. In the realm of political communication, Churchill's speeches established the gold standard for what crisis rhetoric should achieve, a fusion of honesty and hope. He famously refused to sugarcoat realities, yet he never allowed despair to dominate. This equilibrium became a benchmark against which other leaders were measured. During natural disasters, terrorist attacks, pandemics, and economic collapses, commentators often asked whether leaders could rise to Churchillian heights in their public addresses. The comparison revealed an enduring truth. Even long after his death, Churchill remained the yardstick for speechcraft under pressure. His ability to transform suffering into strength, danger into purpose, and uncertainty into unity has seldom been replicated. Beyond politics, Churchill's influence reached into culture, literature, and education. His mastery of narrative inspired filmmakers, historians, and novelists who sought to capture the drama and moral magnitude of World War II. His wartime speeches became the backbone of documentaries, museum exhibits, and memorial services. Students analyzing persuasive writing encountered his words as exemplary texts that demonstrated the persuasive power of rhythm, repetition, metaphor, and moral contrast. In this sense, Churchill's rhetoric did not merely survive the war, it transcended it, becoming part of the global cultural heritage. Generations learned not only about the war itself, but about the craft of leadership through the study of Churchill's voice. Yet Churchill's rhetorical legacy was not without controversy. Critics pointed out that his gift for language sometimes overshadowed his strategic miscalculations or political flaws. They argued that his eloquence could occasionally romanticize warfare or obscure the imperial assumptions embedded in his worldview. These critiques, far from diminishing his stature, highlighted the complexity of his legacy. They revealed a truth Churchill himself often acknowledged, that great leaders are never perfect, yet their imperfections do not negate their contributions. Indeed, the very debates about Churchill's legacy testify to the lasting impact of his words. They invite continual reassessment, reconsideration, and reinterpretation. His speeches remain alive precisely because they provoke reflection, not blind reverence. Ultimately, the most profound measure of Churchill's legacy lies in the millions of ordinary people whose lives were steadied, strengthened, or redeemed by his voice. Workers who toiled through nights of air raids, soldiers who clung to hope in distant deserts, parents who soothed frightened children in gaslit shelters, all carried his words within them as a source of courage. Churchill proved that language, at its highest elevation, can become a form of leadership more potent than armies. His voice helped save a civilization under siege and redefine the relationship between leaders and the led. Decades after the war, his speeches still echo through history, reminding societies that in the darkest moments, words can illuminate the path to survival, dignity, and destiny. The influence of Churchill's wartime oratory did not stop at Britain's shores. It radiated outward, shaping the spirit of peoples and lands far beyond the immediate reach of his nation. During the years when the Axis seemed poised to dominate continents, Churchill's voice became a beacon to oppressed populations who clung to whispers of hope transmitted over scratchy radios or printed in clandestine leaflets. In occupied Europe, where Nazi brutality smothered freedom, his speeches were illegal to possess yet eagerly sought. In the shadows of basements in Warsaw, in attics in Amsterdam, in vineyards across rural France, people risked arrest to hear fragments of his words. To them, Churchill represented the living proof that resistance was not futile, that somewhere beyond the darkness stood a leader unyielding to tyranny. His voice turned distant hope into emotional sustenance. In France, particularly during the desperation of 1940 and 1941, Churchill's speeches served as moral reinforcement for the nascent resistance. His condemnation of Nazi occupation and his insistence that France had not fallen forever offered wounded civilians and scattered fighters a form of spiritual ammunition. Gaulle himself drew enormous strength from Churchill's words, incorporating their tone into his own broadcasts from London. Churchill's rhetoric shaped the psychology of the Free French. Defiance, endurance, the conviction that liberty could be resurrected. Without this rhetorical backbone, the resistance might have lacked the cohesion and moral clarity needed to endure years of clandestine struggle. Across the Atlantic, his speeches were instrumental in reshaping American public sentiment before Pearl Harbor. At a time when isolationism still dominated U.S. politics, Churchill's voice penetrated the national debate with remarkable force. He framed the war not as a European quarrel but as a global struggle for the survival of democratic values. Many Americans first understood the moral stakes of the conflict through Churchill's phrasing. His alliance building with Roosevelt was rooted not only in geopolitical necessity but in linguistic commonality. Both men spoke the language of freedom with emotive brilliance. Churchill's influence on American opinion helped create the psychological groundwork for the arsenal of democracy, ensuring that U.S. support would grow into decisive intervention. In the British Empire, Churchill's oratory carried a complex but undeniable power. Soldiers from India, Kenya, South Africa, the Caribbean, Australia, and New Zealand fought under the banner of a leader most had never seen in person. Many of them heard Churchill's voice through the BBC Empire service, which broadcast messages tailored to diverse cultures across the globe. His words affirmed their contributions and elevated their sacrifices into the central narrative of the war. While many colonial subjects longed for independence and questioned imperial hierarchies, they nonetheless drew courage from Churchill's depiction of the conflict as a moral crusade. His rhetoric helped mobilize millions across continents, demonstrating the astonishing reach of language in a world connected only by radio waves and long-distance cables. Even in neutral nations, particularly those balancing between Axis pressure and Allied persuasion, Churchill's speeches influenced political decisions in subtle but profound ways. In Scandinavia, his calls for freedom resonated deeply with leaders fearful of German expansion. In Turkey, his careful phrasing emphasized the long-term moral and strategic benefits of siding with the Allies. In Spain and Portugal, where authoritarian regimes navigated the dangerous middle ground between the competing powers, Churchill's warnings against Nazi domination shaped their calculations. Although these nations did not openly join the Allied cause until late, or at all, Churchill's rhetorical presence constrained their alignment with the Axis, limiting the enemy's ability to expand its sphere of influence. But perhaps the most profound global impact of Churchill's wartime voice was on occupied Germany itself. Though Nazi propaganda worked tirelessly to portray him as a caricature of decadence and decadence, many Germans secretly tuned into the BBC, drawn by curiosity, doubt, or quiet resistance. Churchill's speeches, translated and broadcast by the BBC German service, introduced a counter-narrative that undermined the totalitarian monopoly on truth. He spoke not only of defeating Nazism but of the future of the German people, a future free from Hitler's tyranny. This distinction between the German regime and the German population planted seeds of moral reawakening in listeners who longed for the end of oppression. His words offered a vision of redemption rather than annihilation, a message that later facilitated Germany's peaceful reintegration into the post-war world. The global reverberations of Churchill's voice were amplified by the medium through which they traveled, the radio. The microphone became his battlefield, the broadcast his artillery. He had an intuitive understanding of how radio compressed geographical distance and emotional barriers. Unlike print, radio conveyed tone, the gravel in his voice, the pauses charged with conviction, the rising cadence that signaled resolve. Listeners across continents felt the presence of a man who seemed to stand beside them in the darkest hours. His speeches were not abstractions but experiences, atmospheric, intimate, urgent. This sensory immediacy magnified his influence, enabling one leader to speak into the hearts of millions scattered across the globe. By war's end, Churchill's words had left an imprint on the world far beyond Britain's strategic reach. His speeches helped unify resistance movements, shape foreign policy, encourage American intervention, and counterbalance Axis propaganda on a global scale. They fostered solidarity among people separated by oceans and cultures, proving that language, when wielded with conviction and moral purpose, could traverse borders as effectively as armies. Churchill's rhetorical influence became a defining feature of the Allied victory, not merely because of the power of his voice, but because he articulated a universal message, that tyranny anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. His wartime oratory did not simply rally a nation, it ignited a world. As the years turned into decades, the world Churchill had helped to save evolved into something he could only partly recognize. New nations emerged from the collapse of empires, global institutions reshaped diplomacy, and revolutionary technologies transformed communication. Yet amid this shifting landscape, Churchill's wartime voice remained astonishingly present. His speeches echoed at commemorations in textbooks, and across the airwaves every anniversary of the Blitz or D-Day. They became part of the architecture of global memory, a repository of courage preserved in sound. Scholars debated his strategic decisions, historians revisited his policies, and critics examined his contradictions, but none could deny the vitality of the language that had once steeled a nation. His words outlived the man, continuing to resonate long after his passing in 1965, as though the voice itself had become a monument carved into time. In Britain, Churchill became both a historical figure and a mythic symbol, a fusion of flesh and blood statesman and near-legendary defender of freedom. Each new generation rediscovered him in its own way. For some, he was the wartime guardian who kept the nation from collapse. For others, he was a flawed leader whose triumphs coexisted with controversial views. But all could agree on one truth: his oratory had shaped the emotional and moral landscape of the 20th century. The nation he once rallied still turned to his speeches in moments of crisis, listening again to his gravelly resolve, searching for echoes of the defiance that saved them. His words became a form of national inheritance, an heirloom passed from parent to child, a reminder that courage could be summoned through language. The global community, too, preserved Churchill's rhetorical legacy. In countries liberated from Axis rule, his speeches became artifacts of resistance. In the United States, they became symbols of shared democratic purpose. In Eastern Europe, they were remembered as early warnings against totalitarian oppression. Even nations once aligned with the Axis studied his communication methods, admiring his ability to mobilize societies through persuasion rather than coercion. Political leaders across continents quoted him in times of turmoil, invoking his descriptions of hardship, unity, and perseverance. His speeches transcended their origins, evolving into universal lessons on leadership, that honesty must accompany inspiration, that strength must be paired with humility, and that words, when chosen wisely, can fortify the human spirit against fear. As new crises unfolded, from the Cold War to regional conflicts to global terrorism, Churchill's rhetorical blueprint proved surprisingly durable. Leaders studied his cadence, his metaphors, his strategic honesty. They borrowed his techniques for rallying divided nations, calming fearful populations, or framing moral dilemmas. Yet while many attempted to emulate him, few could match the sincerity that underpinned his oratory. For Churchill, words were not performance but conviction. He believed what he said with unshakable resolve, and this authenticity, more than any technique, gave his speeches enduring strength. Even today, leaders who seek to summon Churchillian gravitas discover that the power of his oratory cannot be imitated without sharing his willingness to bear personal responsibility for the fate of a nation. Churchill's literary legacy further amplified his influence. His memoirs, essays, and histories offered not only accounts of the war but reflections on leadership, destiny, and human nature. Through his writing, he continued to shape how the world understood the moral dimensions of conflict. He framed World War II not simply as a geopolitical struggle but as a universal confrontation between freedom and tyranny, civilization and barbarism, a framing so powerful that it remains embedded in global consciousness even today. His ability to narrate history while simultaneously shaping its meaning ensured that his voice endured not merely as memory, but as an interpretive force guiding how future generations understood the past. Yet perhaps the greatest testament to Churchill's enduring power came not from scholars or politicians, but from ordinary people who continued to feel a personal connection to his voice. Elderly survivors of the Blitz still remembered sitting in dim shelters, clutching radios as his words broke through the static. Veterans recalled hearing his broadcasts crackle across foreign deserts or frozen seas, reminding them that home had not forgotten them. Children born long after the war listened to recordings and sensed, somehow, the emotional gravity that had sustained their grandparents. This intergenerational resonance transformed Churchill's speeches into living relics, tactile experiences capable of transmitting courage across time. As the 21st century dawned, Churchill's oratory took on new relevance in a world struggling with disinformation, polarization, and the erosion of trust in institutions. Citizens once again looked for leaders capable of balancing truth with hope, honesty with vision. Churchill's legacy served as a reminder that rhetoric could be a force for clarity rather than confusion, unity rather than division. In an age of fragmented communication, his speeches demonstrated the power of words to forge collective purpose. They stood as proof that even in chaos, a single voice, resolute, sincere, morally anchored, could steady the course of history. Today, Churchill's words remain among the most powerful ever spoken by a modern leader. They continue to teach that language is not merely a tool of governance, but a pillar of civilization, capable of summoning armies, consoling the grieving, inspiring resistance, and redefining the destiny of nations. His voice, once carried across the airwaves to a world trembling under tyranny, now echoes through history as both warning and inspiration. Churchill used words as weapons, forging victory from the raw material of language. And though the wars he fought have faded into the past, his speeches endure as reminders that in humanity's darkest hours, the strength to persevere often begins with a single, unforgettable voice.